listener production.
I'm automotive commentator and journalist Greg Rust, and this is Rusty's Garage. I'm in Melbourne for this episode on the eve of the Motorsport Australia Gala Awards. My guest is Roland Dane, an incredibly successful team owner with immense drive and a thirst for victory that's never waned over the years. His squad has a very impressive record in Australia and before that in the UK. In Supercars alone, there are 8 Drivers' Championships, 9 Teams' Championships and 7 wins in the famed Bathurst 1000. That's at the time we recorded. No doubt the tally will grow. If you follow Supercars, you'll have seen him entrenched in his Red Bull Holden racing team pit garage with a trademark notepad in his pocket, always keeping track of things to improve or fix. The story goes that he was once congratulated by a rival team owner for being among the few to build a profitable business in world motorsport. It's a tough game, and that's not easily done. With success comes the knockers. Not everyone who follows the sport likes him. They've labelled him a power broker and worse. That doesn't bother Roland, but if you listen, maybe your view will change or at least give you a greater appreciation for the man, his determination, his work ethic and management style. In many ways, he's like a champion chess player. Now, if you don't like some things he says, I'm not going to apologise for that. I've always believed the podcast was about our guest and their view. We'll even the ledger, if we need to, with the right of reply. That's another strong policy I have. We cover some ground in our discussion, including the high-profile defection of his long-standing engineer, Ludo Lacroix, how close he went to signing Simona Di Silvestro, and the shock decision by General Motors to kill off the legendary Holden brand. That's later. His journey began in the UK, where he gravitated to mechanical things from a very young age.
I had my first car when I was 12 years old, which was a thing called a Morris 1000, when we'd moved from Ireland to England. And my father decided I could spend £50 of my grandfather's money on buying a Morris 1000 that I could take apart, put back together, drive around the yard. Not that they called it a yard over there, but drive it around the paddock, as it were, and up and down the dirt road to their house, my parents' house there. And then went on from there, to be honest. And by the time I was 16, I was heavily into motorcycles.
Is it fair to say that you are a student of life, Roland, a student of motorsport? That probably sums you up in some ways?
I've got plenty of interest outside motorsport, and I also like to think that the grounding that my parents and grandparents gave me enabled me to see more than just the field I operate in today. But yeah, we've got a very diverse family, and even now I've got one daughter who loves motorsport and another one who loves horses, very different. I think it does everyone good to have things outside their immediate sphere of work, as it were, even if it's something that you really enjoy, but you also can see further than that and enjoy other things.
People see Roland Dane, the success story now, but it was far from that to begin with. It was very humble beginnings in many respects for you, wasn't it?
Oh, certainly in motorsport, I had to earn my stripes, and I was never any good as a rider or a driver beyond a very amateur level. But even trying to run teams, everything I know and practice today comes from watching other people years ago and being lucky enough to be around some very good operators, etc. Being able to hang out for many years with my best mate Derek Warwick, and really see with him some of the best operators in the business. But No, I left school when I was 18 in the UK and went to work for Panther Car Company and building cars for the first 10 years or so of my life before I started working for myself. And then I had built up the business that I still have in the UK today that sells cars around the world. That in the late 80s built that up myself, and it's been a lot of fun at the same time as the motorsport. But motorsport's the thing that I've enjoyed the most, and I have had to put a lot of effort into trying to get it right.
Were you a bit of a gopher at Panther, and what sort of roles did you have there? Because I sense it was many and varied, and that helped you in lots of ways.
Yeah, when I first went to work there, the company was owned and run by a guy called Robert Jankel, and he was an entrepreneur. It was basically from the fashion industry, the rag trades it was called in those days, and but he loved cars, and he started building cars as a hobby, and then it became a business, and it was a very interesting business, but small. 50, 60 people in the mid 70s when I first went to work there, but I was very privileged in that he took me immediately under his wing, and then got me to work in each department of the business. So, work in the body shop, work in the assembly shop, work in the paint shop, etc., work in the trim shop for a few months, work in the accounts department, and work in the sales department to try and give me a broad understanding of what went in to operating a business like that. So I actually look back on that, and I was looking back at it and discussing it at a PWR board meeting the other day, this week, in that type of apprenticeship, informal apprenticeship, if you like, and how well it served me, and taking some of those lessons to discuss around the board table at PWR the other day. So I was very privileged.
I want to tap back into something you said a moment ago, because I can hear our listeners saying, hey, ask more about that, about the fact that you did compete. So two-part question. Firstly, the two-wheel side, because I know you love the bikes. Was there a two-wheel hero, and what kind of bike racing did you do?
So my father hated motorcycles, and he wouldn't allow me to have anything more than a Honda 50, like a postie bike. So I had a number of them. I think I had 6 or 7, and so that I could build 1 or 2 good ones out of the wreckage of 6 or 7 of them. And but unbeknown to him, I don't think he ever knew actually until the day he died, that halfway in between home and school, I had an arrangement with the father of a friend of mine to use one of his lockups. He had 50-odd lockup garages in the back of the town where the school was. So I dropped the postie bike in there because it wasn't cool to arrive at school on that. And I had a Honda 305 that I rode then to school. So I was heavily into them, and when I moved out of home into London, when I was first working for Panther, I started racing motorcycles, and joined local club and etc. I think it was called the ACU in the UK, the equivalent of Motorsport Australia or something on 2 wheels. Got my license, went and bought a thing called a Triumph Tiger Cub, and with a mate of mine who was one of the people sharing the house with, we bought an old Ford Transit, knackered Ford Transit, and put our bikes in the back and went racing. And the first year was an absolute disaster because the Triumph Tiger Cubs were some of the shittiest bikes you'd ever come across. We were lucky if we got a lap of practice before they broke down or something happened or whatever, or a combination of breaking down, us falling off. It was a particularly useless period. But luckily somebody had invented Yamahas, and I loved those bikes, the 250s and the 400s. We used to race the 400s in the 500 class. 2 strokes, which you could work on very easily, take apart very easily in the front room of the house, and put together yourself, etc. You could play with them, you could tune them, you could learn a lot pretty quickly on how to make them go. And of course they always reliable. So you get a full day's racing. So that was my first 3 or 4 years or so of racing was on two wheels.
Were you getting the knee down, and were there ambitions to be a Barry Sheene or a Kenny Roberts or somebody like that?
Well, I certainly wasn't getting the knee down. Production tyres in those days weren't really good enough to do that, even if I'd been good enough. But I spent an awful lot of time going as well to watch bike racing. I loved going to watch bike racing, and some huge crowds in those days in the 70s, particularly going to watch big money races, where guys were getting paper bags full of cash to go and race in those days. The stars, they'd rock up. And watching people like Agostini, Phil Reed, Barry Sheene, Kenny Roberts race when they'd come to the UK, and we used to go to Assen as well, because that was and it still remains a traditional trek for POMs, like four-wheel ones go to watch Le Mans. Yeah. In two wheels, people always go to the Dutch TT to Assen, and so we'd go over there each year. But certainly the heroes. I mean, you've recently spoken to one of the heroes from that era, and I haven't listened to it yet, but Graham Crosby, who I met for the first time a couple of years ago in New Zealand. But he was a real hero. Greg Hansford, because he really had to wring the neck of his Kawasaki on the big bike. It just wasn't as quick as the Yamahas. And on the smaller bike, he was too big for them. He was really too big for 250s and 350s, which is why he struggled to beat Cork Ballington, who's South African, who lives in Australia now. So those guys were definitely people that I looked up to, watched, was fascinated by their lifestyle as well. They had Mercedes Sprinter vans, 308 diesel vans, I think they were, with a caravan on the back, one or two mechanics often themselves, and 3 or 4 bikes in the back, and they'd go off and they'd race every weekend. And the Grand Prix didn't really pay them any money, but these other races would pay them big money. And so to go to places like Mallory Park or Brands Hatch or Alton Park and watch them rock up and compete, do 20 laps, 25 lap races, but do it 3 or 4 times during the day, and sometimes on different bikes. The front row had as many people as could stuff onto the front row. It wasn't very organised, those races, but they were fantastic.
Great period, great memories that you've recounted there. There is a 4-wheel chapter for you two driving, and I want to say it's a Honda Civic. Is that right? Tell me about that. Where did you race? How did you go? And I think even when Jess arrived, very soon after Jess arrived into the world, you still went off racing, didn't you? Yeah,
so the first car I bought was a Ford Fiesta, actually, a one-make Fiesta racing in the early 80s. So, bikes, I'd finished bike racing when I realised that I wasn't quite stupid enough, I don't think. I was a member of the Self-Preservation Society, and and almost every other person every time we'd race at Snetterton wasn't. And so I had a lot of fun, but then I decided I fell off. I didn't break anything, but I badly hurt my shoulder. And so I thought, okay, well, time for 4 wheels. I'd got married as well. So I had a Fiesta, one make car, which I did a little bit in, a couple of seasons of racing with that. Then setting up business, all the rest of it. So for several years I didn't race, etc. And my first daughter, Alexandra, was born. And then I got back into it on the back of really being encouraged by Derek, and so ended up with Honda Civic CRX, the little one-make championship, and then migrating into what was called Group N back then with Civics, and it was a very enjoyable period. I wasn't brilliant at it, But we now did get a good result because, you know, it was half wet and I was the only person who could afford new tyres or whatever it was at the time. I enjoyed it a lot.
You've touched on business and your success there, and the guys at the car sales website here in Australia reminded me of, I mean, there's been restaurants, hotels, things like that, but you touched on the car company before and the longevity of that and what you've done. Just expand on it a little bit more. I mean, there was 1 year there, I think, where you, might have been Rolls or Bentleys, I can't remember, maybe both. You sold nearly 100 in a year, and were you hands-on with that? What were you doing?
Oh, very hands-on. We were selling right-hand drive vehicles around the Asian markets, really. Hong Kong, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, all right-hand drive, same as the UK. So, and there was an active parallel market in luxury cars that we were servicing big time. And in 1993, I sold 93 new Rolls-Royce and Bentley cars. They were the same company then. And a year or two before, they had some new model come out, and they sent a note to all the dealers in the UK that there were two people's names that they didn't want to see on the waiting list. And one was a guy called William Lochran, a very successful UK dealer even today, and myself. And I took that as a bit of an honour that they didn't. But by the time we got to 93, the UK was having a very hard time. So at the end of that year, I actually got a Christmas card from the Rolls-Royce boss. Thanks for your efforts. And so that had been it wasn't good in the UK business at that point, but in overseas for us, it was extremely good.
People talk now about, you know, the challenges of doing business in Asia. Did you find that challenging? What were the learnings in that period like?
I had to learn it the hard way. So I'd learned something about dealing in the Middle East with Panther in the early 80s, and then I first went to Japan in 1986, and from there had to quite quickly, you know, there wasn't the resources, if you like, in terms of looking up and Googling how do you operate business-wise in Japan. So I had to learn it pretty quickly, and then understand that Asia wasn't all the same. So what was good etiquette in Japan wasn't in Thailand or Malaysia, etc. So. And in those days, that was pre-single market in Europe. So, and I had an Irish passport and an English passport, which I still have, but I have an Australian one as well now. But the way that Irish and English citizens got treated in different countries rather, for visa to visa, changed where you were. So in Japan, you always used the English passport, because the Irish one, you needed a visa to get in, and so you used the POMI one to get in there. On the other hand, if I'd gone to Brunei on a Irish one, they would have thought I was a member of the IRA or something, so you used the English one. In Malaysia, you'd go in there and you'd get 3 months on your passport if you were Irish and 2 weeks if you were English. So you quickly learnt how to operate under across the different countries and the different cultures, and it's something, to be honest, today I still value the fact that, you know, one of my oldest friends is the Lamborghini dealer in Hong Kong, who was just texting me last night to ask if one of his nephews could come and spend the weekend with us at the Grand Prix, because he's into karting in China.
I want to, before we get to Derek Warwick and more of the motorsport stuff in a second here, I want to just turn right very briefly. Quick little yarn that people mightn't know is that you project managed a hovercraft build. Did you? I think you were testing it in a lake by the M4 in the UK or something or other. Tell us a bit about that project.
Yeah, you've done a bit of homework. So I'd become very interested in hovercraft in the late 70s, when I was racing bikes as well, or actually before I left home. I'd met a guy called Nigel Beale, and he was a professor at Cranfield University, but he was also a hovercraft nutcase, and he had come up with this kit or set of drawings, really, plus some bits and pieces to put together your own hovercraft using a little Rotax two-stroke engine and everything. And anyway, so I was also fascinated because he had come up with a concept in 1978. You remember the fan car, the Brabham fan car? Well, Chapman had gone to him the next day after that Swedish Grand Prix and said, we need your expertise to make our own fan car with 2 fans, one in either side pod. Anyway, it didn't come to anything because it got banned, as you know, the Brabham. So it put the lid on it. But he was the go-to person for fans, hovercraft of smaller sized hovercraft, etc. So I built this hovercraft in the garage at my parents' house, actually, when I was still at school, and I actually road tested it first across their lawns, and I made the skirt on my mother's sewing machine for it. Which I was very proud of at the time. She wasn't particularly happy with the way her sewing machine was treated, but it all worked. And the day I first ran it, I actually killed one of my father's ornamental ducks. He had a load of ornamental ducks around the property, and I ran one over. Unfortunately, killed it because I wasn't steering it very well. But I learned how to steer it, and then started racing that as well, and that was there was a lot of fun, actually. I didn't do that much of it, but over a couple of years I raced that hovercraft and had a lot of near misses, let me tell you, because they're quick on wet grass, especially country estates where they'd hold those races. They were hare racing. Anyway, off the back of that, it so happened that Robert Jankel at Panther had got an inquiry from a guy in the Bahamas to build a hovercraft for him, so we were going to end up building this 6-seater hovercraft at Panther. Well, it was actually at Robert's house in Weybridge, in the barns there, that we built this aluminium hulled hovercraft with input from this guy from Cranfield, Nigel Beale, and we used 2 Honda Goldwing engines, which were 4-cylinder in those days. So one of my best friends, who still runs my business in England for me, was working at a motorcycle dealer, and I rang him up and bought two Honda Goldwings off him, that we then took the engines out of and made into the power units for this hovercraft, which we tested extensively at Thorpe Park, which is next to the M3, not that far from Heathrow. We tested it extensively in there, and we delivered it to old mate in America, but I didn't really hear anything more about it after that.
I love it. Roland Dane, hovercraft racer. I never thought I'd use those words. The connection with Derek Warwick, let's expand on that a little bit. For people listening, I mean, ex-Formula One racer, Le Mans winner, World Sports Cars, did BTCC as well. He, in recent years, had a bit of a battle with cancer, which I'm pleased he's clear of, which is good news. How did the relationship between the two of you come together? It's been strong in a friendship sense, in a business sense, hasn't it, really?
Yeah, so we've known each other for well over 30 years now, and along the way, we've had some huge ups and downs. But to be honest, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was actually in many ways closer to his younger brother. And Paul was an up-and-coming racer in Formula 3, then Formula 3000. And of course, he lived on the mainland in the UK, not very far from me, whereas Derek lived in Jersey, and the Channel Islands still does. So, and Paul's best friend is back in those days that he'd known since he was a kid, is still one of my closest friends today as well, from that area of Hampshire in the south of England. So the thing that really drew, though, Derek and I together was the tragedy around his brother, and we went from being mates to then really being best mates around that time, when July 91, when Paul was killed. Formula 3000 car at Oldham Park. and it was still remains today the most traumatic day of my life, and certainly for him as well, and his family. And it was then after that, in the aftermath of that, which was extremely difficult for him because, do I race? Don't I race? Do I carry on, etc. And but also, the fact that he'd been, I wouldn't say pushing Paul so hard, but he'd been facilitating Paul. He'd been opening doors for him, as you would if you're a Formula One driver and everything, and you've got an up-and-coming younger brother who, to be honest, had the potential to be faster than Derek, and Derek then, I think he felt a bit responsible for it to his parents and everything, etc., which he shouldn't have done. If he did, he shouldn't have done. But he took it very hard, and so we spent an awful lot of time talking to each other and traveling, etc., in the aftermath of that. We'd already raced together in terms of my Hondas were run out of one of his dealerships and all that sort of thing. But that really really brought us together big time, unfortunately, on the back of that tragedy.
The learnings from him too, I think I'm right in saying that for you, he could help the cut through. And motor racing, in the public sense, is this bright, shiny thing, and it has its moments. But as an owner, as someone who's embedded in the sport, you need to cut through in engineering debriefs. You need to get to the heart of things to make stuff better, to win, and so forth. And he was very good at helping you learn in that side of it, I think. Is that correct? Yeah,
he certainly made a big difference to me in terms of increasing my knowledge at a professional level much faster than I otherwise would have done, but also the fact that he had worked with some good people that I could also see. When you walked into that Peugeot garage, for instance, 92, when they were running the Sports Car World Championship, the year he won Le Mans, but when you walked into the garage or wherever they were racing, etc., you could see a level of calmness, a level of professionalism that was missing from a lot of places. You could see when he was racing the Jaguar the year before, the XJR 14, where Ross Brawn was the guy who designed it and the chief engineer there, etc. You could see an attention to detail in the car, etc., which was something to look up to at the time. I mean, to be honest, those cars, from both the Jaguar at that time and the Peugeot, and probably the Sauber at the time, I wasn't close enough to it, but they were better than half the F1 grid in terms of the way that they were put together and the way that they were very good bits of engineering, which is why, of course, certain people in the motorsport world decided that Group C, as it was then, shouldn't really exist, and that Formula One had to be the preeminent thing, and really snuffed Group C out. Was there ever a want to go to Formula One? I mean, we look at what you've achieved in England and here, and we'll get to that in a moment, but was Formula One ever on your radar, and if not, why not? Well, I was offered a job as a buyer at a small team, Fittipaldi team, in 1980. I think it was 79 or 80 when I was at Panther, and I didn't take it, and maybe I should have done as a way in. But then Derek and I used to talk about it in the early 90s. Is there a point at which we could do something? Was it achievable and everything? And to be honest, we saw the pain that some of the people were going through at that stage. I knew Mike Earl, who was running the Moneytron team, or Onyx became Moneytron, etc., in the late 80s, early 90s period, and you could see how hard work that was. Then Eddie Jordan came along in 91, and heard all the stories back then about how hard it was to keep going, and honestly, we thought it was that's we're not prepared to take those risks by the time we were in sort of mid-90s. We weren't prepared to.
So there is a little backstory about 888, what it means in terms of its name. But what was the point where you decided to form this and hit the go button and in a business sense, go motor racing?
Yeah, well, I was driving myself early 90s, etc. I was also owned several BTCC cars that James Kay was driving, for instance, in 93, 92, 93. And then there was the opportunity to be part of something becoming more professional, setting up as a business with Derek, Ian Harrison, and an engineer called John Gentry. And this was really mid-90s. BTCC was extremely strong, almost too strong for its own good. There were too many manufacturers there. They couldn't all win. And Derek was a very successful Honda dealer by that stage, with, I can't remember, 4 or 5 different dealerships in the south of England. So there was an opportunity to potentially take on the Honda deal if we could put something together. Well, we didn't get that, but then we did get GM, because GM Vauxhall, the motorsport manager, rang Derek and said, "I gather you're trying to put something together. Would you be interested in doing it for us?" So Derek called me and I said, "Yeah, well, let's try and do it." And I put the business plan together for it and gave it to GM, and they took us on, and that started a relationship which in the UK lasted until 2009, on the back end of the GFC when it eventually finished. But and I also, a very good operator in Ian Harrison, who remains a good friend today, and Derek, myself, we were not only building and running the cars in the UK, but we were selling cars to Sweden. We had a couple of cars running in Turkey at one point. We were running a one-make series for Vauxhall as well, with the Vectras in the late 90s as well. So it was a good period, very busy period, and a good period, and we had a really nice factory, an old Ministry of Defence site in between Banbury and Silverstone, that latterly has been used by Multimatic and Ganassi to run their Ford program, which finished the end of last year, but in Europe. And but that building was built like a brick shithouse, because it was so well built, and it was a part of a listening station for GCHQ, because it was on a very high bit of ground. So beautifully built place, and we put together I think a pretty good operation there.
Common causes of oversteer: cold tires, rear-wheel drive, wet roads, or the most common, P-platers and peer pressure.
You've ridden some great waves, a golden period in supercars in Australia, super touring in the 90s. When you spoke about that before, it was awesome. Insane budgets, fantastic racing, engineering that was phenomenal. How big, give us a sense of how big that operation got, with all the categories you talked about running before, and, the Vectra program was a big deal, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't the biggest, though, in those days. I mean, our budget was one of the smaller ones, but it still seems obscene today. We got up to about 60 people, probably just over at the height of it. And when we were running 3 cars with a full factory budget in 2000. So, it was big. We were making very good money out of it, but we didn't have the budget that ProDrive had from Ford, for instance, and Nissan they were spending as well with RML. So I could see that it was going to implode, honestly. And the marketing budgets in the UK were starting to be cut drastically. Yeah, the world was changing. The UK, the car market, I can't remember which of the manufacturers coined the term, but in the 90s, they used to call it Treasure Island because they were making so much money there. So, but that started to change. The world started to change in late 90s and got a lot more difficult. And this was even pre 9/11. And so budgets got cut, and we had to very quickly cut our cloth at 888 to suit a brave new world in 2001 with BTCC, where almost all the other teams had either disappeared overnight or had to find something else to do.
It's a strength of yours, isn't it? You're not just thinking about Australian Grand Prix next or Winton down the road. You're thinking years in advance. Have you always been like that?
Oh, I've tried to anticipate things because, don't forget, I've worked in the broader industry for so long, and I'm a very keen student of what's going on around the world, in the car world, etc., in particular. And so, therefore, some of the things that have happened you can anticipate. You can't anticipate the effects of viruses or something, but you can see what's happening in a developing automotive world. And so some of the road bumps have been possible to foresee. You can't always avoid them, but maybe you can lessen the blow sometimes. And so in that period, in the early 2000s, it was very necessary just for BTCC to survive, to recut the category, recut the series on a completely different financial level. Otherwise, it would have withered away.
Before that period of change, one box that you ticked, which I think is really cool, is Bathurst. So you knew from family about Bathurst. Am I right in saying you used to get kind of newspaper clippings or something or other sent to your family? He would talk to you about it. And it was always held in really high regard by you, even before you came here in the late 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, my godfather, who's long passed away now, but he was a GP in Adelaide. And so he, very early on, I can't remember when, but for years and years, he gave me a subscription to Wheels magazine. And I always, to be honest, I loved the magazine anyway, because it was, in those days, it wasn't an advertorial. It was a very irreverent magazine, and had a different approach. But it also showed me, for the first time, exposed me to Bathurst and stories about it. And then in the mid-'80s, when the likes of Walkinshaw, Soper, etc., were coming out and racing at Bathurst in the sort of Group A era, the BBC used to show highlights of the race later the same day, obviously a big time difference, so they'd show 1 or 2 hour highlights package, etc. And it was pretty wild to see this circuit, and see how good the racing was, or looked at next to what the average one we had in the circuit we had in the UK. So I had an appreciation of it. But of course, then in '97, when Vesco, as it was then, and Toker Australia, and they're all at war, etc. And it wasn't our war over in the UK, but we were given the opportunity to be mercenaries and come out and paid very big money to come and race in '97 and '98 at Bathurst in the 2-litre race. So of course we took it with open arms. Firstly, our season was over. Secondly, we all wanted to come here, and thirdly, we were going to earn some good coin. So we came, '97. Derek drove with Brocky, and then back in '98, we had Derek driving with Cleland, and we had also Murphy driving with Ingle in a car that Holden paid for separately. to be honest, I think we got paid for that twice. I think Channel 7 paid us and Holden paid us. So that was 98 was a good result. But it was an engineering challenge because we'd never raced the cars that far, so we had we did quite a lot of testing during, not so much 97, because it crept up in 97 pretty quickly, but when we realised what the challenge was in 98, we did 2 tests at Pembrey in Wales with a specific aim of running the cars for 8 hours to see would they stand up to. Yeah, and there are a couple of very slow corners there that sort of put a big strain on the front-wheel drive system, and we ended up the weak point of the cars was the universal joint on the front axle, both sides, and so we ended up having this grease which would actually run the 1,000 Ks, which was I think 1,200 pounds a tin, and we needed half a dozen tins of this stuff to get us through the weekend. So it was crazy, but it worked. The grease worked, but unfortunately, a couple of other things happened when Derek drove off with a fuel tower attached to the car in the race, which caused us plenty of hassle, and Russell crashed at the skyline on somebody else's oil. So it wasn't as I think we could have been podium that day. Certainly with the Ingle Murphy car, we could have been on the podium. Probably not beaten the Nissan or the Volvo that day, but we could have been on the podium.
Did you fall in love with the place, and was it everything and more in terms of what you'd read about, and what was it like? People listening to the podcast will fondly remember Brocky, who's gone now and has been since 2006. What was it like working with him?
I'd met him a couple of times in the UK because he'd come over regularly and spend time with Alan Gow, who ran BTCC, and Gow's missus and mine were very friendly, etc. So I'd met him. I knew him, half knew him before, and obviously had a few quirks and everything. Like to have some herbal tea on him at all times, etc. And we went with the flow, honestly, because he was the superstar. When we came over, he was the star, and so we did what we needed to do to work around that and give him what he needed. We tried to point out that rear-wheel drive cars, the rear tires are cold, but his first lap in 97, he rolled it. He rolled it at the kink, coming into the Caltex chase. He rolled it, and it took us an all-nighter and most of the next day to rebuild the car to get it out on track again. After that, and after that, he realised that the rear tyres needed a bit of work to get the temp up on a front-wheel drive car. But it was fascinating. The real thing, though, that was depressing was you had this magnificent track and you had an absolute shithole of a pit lane, and I couldn't believe that you'd got this beautiful circuit, and the facilities there were just dreadful. I mean, it was worse than Snetterton had been 20 years before, and that was shitty. So that was a disappointment, big disappointment to see how crap they were. Yeah.
Since then, it's gone through a massive upgrade, and we'll get to your supercar stuff in a second. Did you ever entertain the idea of moving to MotoGP? Was it some chat about maybe a 125 or a Moto3 team that you loosely toyed with the idea of expanding into? Am I correct there?
Well, it was more a case of sort of going off and doing that instead, if you like. A few years ago, I can't remember exactly, 2010, 2011 or something, and thinking that would be something good to go and do. And because I still love it. Yeah, I still love the whole bike scene. And and I worked on a couple of opportunities that I thought there might be something to do there, but they never got beyond embryonic stage, unfortunately. But it's a chapter that ship sailed now, but it's a chapter I wish that maybe I should have put more effort into it, because it would have been fun.
Early 2000s, I think you'll tell me if I've got this incorrect, but you're about 45 years old. You start discussions about a move to Australia and supercars. What was the beginning of that? What was the point where you thought, I'm going to get on this freight train and have a crack at this?
Yeah, there are a few things going on. To be honest, so personally, had a divorce, separated in 1999. And business-wise, needed a new challenge. BTCC had, on the back of having to reposition it, the cars weren't very exciting. They were very necessary at the time, but pretty boring compared with what we had beforehand. And there wasn't as much money in it, obviously, so you couldn't earn as much from it. So number of different things, and so I'd been out to 2001. I came to Surfers Paradise to the IndyCar race. Caught up with people I knew there, had a look around, met Cochrane for the first time, spoke to him about what was going on and what it looked like, what the commercial landscape was. Came back in a year later, did the same thing, and I thought, look, honestly, I'm sort of ready to have a serious look at this. And then I hadn't done very much about it, but the early 03, the Walkinshaw group fell over. And so, as you know, Holden went and picked up the pieces, but of course, Holden, being a manufacturer, weren't allowed to own the teams. So they had to then divest themselves, if you like, of the two teams that Walkinshaw had been running. And so a guy called Kevin Whale was an Australian who'd worked at Holden and also at GM in Singapore. By this time he was running GM in the UK, and so we'd reported to him. He was my direct report, if you like, for Triple Eight in the UK. And I said to him, any chance? I think we could go down there and do a good job. And he tried to facilitate the introductions, etc. But the politics around it all was out of control, as I can see now. Later I could see. And they offered us the second tier thing which then became the Kelly's board. They offered us that, but I said, no, if we can't be the main thing, then I don't want to be a part of it, to be honest. And Scafie ended up with it. And in hindsight, it's very good not to have got involved with it, because it all got very messy later on and all the rest of it. But then Paul Radisich had said, look, this guy, John Briggs, in Brisbane, he's probably gone as far as he can with it, and there could be an opportunity there to do something. So I went and saw him, I think in June or July 03. And I'd never been to Brisbane apart from the airport before. So anyway, by this time I already bought an apartment in Toorak, which turned out to be on the floor above Scafie's. But anyway, that was only emerged later. But I only ever stayed in the one in Toorak, I think 3 nights or 4 nights or something. I owned it for a few years. But then, because I thought that would be the place to be, but suddenly Brisbane was on the radar. And so I went and saw John, and we sat down, went through it all, etc. And he told me what he thought it was worth, and I told him what I thought it was worth, and he said, okay, well, thanks very much, but no thanks. So I said, no problem, and went out for dinner with some people and everything, and then went to the airport the next day. And as I was at the airport, he rang up and said, maybe your figure is okay. And I said, all right, okay, well, then I'll get to work on it. And I got KPMG to go and have a look at it, etc., and check it all stacked up. And he had some better electrical money at the moment, and I said, well, you better make sure that's transferable for at least 2004 as well, etc., and some Ford money. And okay, then I said, all right, I'll take the plunge. So I took the plunge along with some money as well from Derek and from Peter Butterley, old Irish friend, and who was spending quite a lot of time in Australia himself as well at that time. And and bought it, and then had to figure out really what was going on and how the championship worked and how the sporting and technical side of it worked really over 2004, and try and set ourselves up during that first year of competition in 2004 for then doing the job properly. You know, there's a huge learning in 2004, but also trying to get the right drivers, get the right people in the team, put a good crew together through that period. And there were some good people already there. They just needed the right leadership. And some of those people are still around me today, as you know.
That's the end of lap 1 of my chat with Roland Dane. Make sure you head back to the library and check out part 2, where we talk about losing a long-standing member of his engineering staff to an arch-rival team and the shock of GM's decision to turn out the lights at Holden. Rusty's Garage is written and presented by me, Greg Rust. Series producer and editor is Alex Mitchell. Audio production by Darcy Thompson.
Listener.